Well, we also looked at another story about water. And this will be our last section tonight. It's also called Meribah. Did you notice that? Yeah, there's a whole different scenario. It's in Numbers chapter 20, verses 8 through 13. The waters of Meribah. See, it even says it in my little section heading, my pericope heading. This is totally different, though. I want to set the scene because this is very confusing, and some even commentators will try and lump the two Water from the Rock episodes together as being the same thing, but they're totally different. This one is 40 years later. So what's happened 40 years later? The first Water from the Rock episode, Meribah and Massah, that was the original generation that came out of the slavery in Egypt, right? This now is their little kids that were watching their parents make decisions, learning from them all the way. They've now grown up, their parents have died, and they are now the wilderness generation. It's them that ends up going into the promised land, okay? Very shortly after this episode. But here we go. What's the situation? Well, there was a lack of water. Okay, let me ask you some questions. Was this new? Was this a new situation? Well, we have to be careful. Was this new for Moses? Let me ask it that way. No, this was not a new situation for Moses. He had seen God be faithful in this way before, right? Moses had a great opportunity to respond in faith. Interestingly enough, the first one, 40 years ago, he responded in faith. He did exactly what God told him to do. But here, for whatever reason, unbelief got the best of him. So it wasn't new for Moses. Let me ask you this question. Was it new for this generation of people? Well, theologically speaking, I'm going to say yes. I mean, they were probably little kids when the first episode happened. Were they paying attention? Do little kids pay attention? No, they weren't paying attention. But did they learn the process of how did they learn from their parents of how to respond to God when a crisis comes up? Yes. And how do we know that? Well, we see it. They respond just like their parents. Grumble, grumble. Complain, complain. Right? So, Moses took the rod. God tells him to speak to the rock, and Moses takes the rod with him, and in a fit of anger, and I think that's safe to say, sometimes our unbelief comes out in fits of anger. Is that getting too close to home? Right? So, in a fit of anger, he takes the rod and he hits the rock. Now, what's the response of God? In the face of unbelief, it's a faithful response. Does water come out? Yes, water comes out. Is the whole generation learning to understand God? Yes. Who is it that gets reprimanded in this scenario? It's Moses. Moses doesn't get to go in because of his what? What does it say? Because of his unbelief, right? We're going to have a great question next week on your lesson about faith and people entering the promised land and what that means from a spiritual standpoint. Get ready for that one. That's going to be a good, hear your responses. I'll definitely weigh in on that one. But it's this episode that keeps Moses out of the promised land. Does this generation of grown-up kids, are they kept out of the promised land? Why? Why do they get to go in and Moses doesn't? Who is testing God here? Moses, according to the formula, Moses is the one testing God here because he had already seen God be faithful in this area of life. He knew that God would be faithful, and he chose a response of unbelief. And it kept him out of God's rest, right? Just like the whole first generation. This second generation, though, first time they've been really hungry. As far as we know, the way the story goes, we don't read of this second generation ever dealing with thirst before. They probably don't remember when they were little kids. Maybe they heard the story. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they don't remember. Do kids remember stories that their parents tell them? Not the ones we want them to remember, right? Okay. So they grow up. God puts a situation in front of them that they can't solve, thirst. They grumble and complain because it's what they know. And God's faithful anyway. It's a good chance for them to learn the characteristics of God. Does God need to I'll take away need. Does God prove himself faithful to every generation? He has to, because it's every generation that has to come to a saving faith in that God. Our kids can't be saved by us and our faith. We can have an influence for sure, but they have to see God work. They have to come to a decision of faith, and it's through that that they can also have the opportunity to enter into God's rest. So, that's the rabbit hole. We've gone down it, and we've looked around a little while, and we're just going to now pop our head up for just a second as we close. I'm going to ask some application questions. And ultimately, what's the best application? What are we supposed to learn from this example? Okay, so we've been asking it all along, but we're just going to try and button it up in a nice, neat little package for you. Well, let me say it this way. Sin causes the world to live in a state of unrest. Okay? Kind of summarizing more than just what we've talked about tonight, but what we've been talking about for weeks. We are not listening to God's voice, and we often try to solve our problems on our own. Right? Good summary so far? But God has a plan. He has a way that this thing is supposed to work. All he wants is for humanity to listen, hear his instruction, and get a move on. Right? That's what rest is. The listening, not just listening, that's part of it, but the get a move on is part of the rest. It's part of living under God's instruction. That's what it's like to live at rest with God. That is what true Sabbath is. It's hearing God's instruction, it's listening, and when we hear, getting a move on. It's having a place to be and a thing to do that God's instructed us to act in. So expect for God to test you. This is what I've learned from this. We should expect God to test us in multiple areas of life. He may test you with food or water. That may be one of your things. I don't know. It seems like in Oregon here, water's not, we're not lacking for water often. Okay, so I can't deal with that one too much. But what other areas of life? Well, I've written down a few. He might test you with your finances. Does that ever happen? How about relationships? Let me name a few. Maybe parents. Struggle with parents ever? How about children? Those of you that have them. Siblings? Well, of course, siblings. Yeah, that's a no-brainer. Neighbors? Yeah. Coworkers? All the time? People on Facebook? Yeah. That's in the book of Enoch. It's in the pseudepigrapha. It's not part of the... Okay. How about plans for your future? If it's not just relationships, how about your plans? Is he going to test you in how you should respond in faith with plans for your future? Yeah. How about your physical health? If you're not there yet, you will be. How about your employment? Are you going to trust God with your employment? Is he going to test you in that area? So I'm not sure how you've been tested. I know how I've been tested. That's pretty much my list. And it seems odd that you've connected with it so well. So when God proves himself faithful, because he will prove himself faithful, no matter how we respond to his test, the question is, can we learn from that? Can we learn from that? And the next time a challenge pops up in that area in our life, what's the question? How are we going to respond? Right? That's the warning. That's the question. That's the test to see whether we are able to enter into his rest or if our hearts become more hard towards the things of God. That's it. If we willfully fall under God's authority and trust him with the circumstances of our lives. That's what rest is. In all areas of our life. And he'll test us in one little one. And then he'll expect a faithful response the next time. And then, what's interesting, is he'll have us apply that area to areas where he's never tested us before. And a true act of faith is not being tested and failing the first time in a new area. The true act of faith is God's proven himself faithful in this and this and this area in my life, and I've seen his works. This one's brand new. What am I going to do? Right? And we have an opportunity to not step out of his rest, a restful position with him where we're under his authority, when a brand new area that we've never experienced his faithfulness in, maybe we're new parents for the first time, right? Because we're always having new things, but whether it's a new job and a new experience, or first time you have teenagers, or the first time, anything new happens in life, no matter how old you are we going to be able to respond in faith? That's really the question. And I'll just bring you back to close in Hebrews 4, verses 9 through 10. I'm going to read it, and hopefully every time I read through this Hebrews passage, you're getting a fuller context of what the conversation is. So there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God, and thank God there does. For the one person who has entered his, God's, rest has himself, the person, also rested from his works, the person's works, as God did from God's works. And how was that? That was a once and for all, no ending on day 7. God rested, he went into his position of authority, and he ruled. And we have the opportunity to step into rest the same way he did, not to dip in and out of it. That's the shadow of the Sabbath. Let's do it once a week. The true invitation that Christ offers us to a Sabbath rest is like God's. Let's step into rest. Let's fall under his authority. Let's trust him in ways we've never been tested before. And let's live a life of rest. What an invitation. How's it end? Let's be diligent. Let's be diligent to do that. The author of Hebrews is pleading with us. He's showing us, and then he's pleading. This is available. Next week, in our last lesson, we'll dive into a little bit more application. We'll go into some other scriptures that bring up these same topics and these same stories, and they bring out more application for us. So, invite you to dive in even further and start asking those questions about how it might apply to your life.